And I will leave the floor to Professor Cristina Pallini, who will introduce our first keynote speaker for this conference. Thank you, Cristina.
Hello. It's a great honor for me to introduce Catherine Maumi. I got to know her 2 years ago in Milan, and ever since she has been a reference for us in the PhD program of our department about discussing how can we build scientific research on our architectural related topics. So you are less alone ever since she stepped into our program, and every year she's coming, and I hope this will continue. Catherine Maumi is professor of history and architectural culture. She holds a PhD in urban studies. She has studied with André Corbeau and Jean-Louis Cohen. Her research, her work has received broad international recognition. She has had a fellowship from the Paul Mellon, CCA in Canada, Berkeley. She is based at the École nationale supérieure d'architecture de Grenoble, and she is leading a research lab entitled Les métiers de l'histoire. Her most recent publication is a book about Frank Lloyd Wright and Broad City. And she is presently studying decentralization policies in the 1920s and 1930s. Please help me welcome Catherine Maumi.
Thanks, Cristina. So many thanks for your invitation today, for your hospitality also. Since yesterday evening, it's just a great pleasure for being here today and tonight. And also so many thanks for the perfect organization of the symposium. I will not speak about case studies, but mainly about theories from the beginning of the 20th century. And what they tried is to think in a different way the relation between city, countryside, and nature. So it will echo some discussions we had last year in Grenoble in November with some of you, and probably also some discussion we had this morning visiting the first site this morning. So let's start. Beginning of the 20th century, so a century ago, the United States did not reflect anymore the ideal garden of the world, which has fostered the imagination of its inhabitants since the end of the 18th century and had built a specific landscape during the 19th century, the pastoral or the middle landscape. The country was then a major industrial and economic force, mainly concentrated on the East Coast, and New York symbolized this new national power. However, this evolution wasn't without serious consequences on the living condition within the urban and the rural world, where a large part of the population got poorer. We all know about the sordid conditions of life of the poorest part of the population within the greatest industrial cities, where housing was a serious problem exacerbated by the increase of the cost of construction as well as of the price of land due to uncontrolled or frenetic speculations on land, on money, on natural resources, and on the work of men and women. Less known is the extreme poverty of a great part of the rural population, even if the surveys done by the great photographers as Walker Evans or Dorothy Lange during the 1930s and 1940s are today largely published. A large number of small farms had already disappeared beginning of the 20th century, and this trend accelerated after the First World War with the changes in production brought by intensive farming. These changes had caused dramatic transformations of the natural landscape and, more important, large-scale ecological disasters as a dust bowl. This tragedy was added to the vast floods along the Tennessee River, for example, created by deforestation and the ruin of large part of the land by the mining industry also. So the picture, beginning of the 20th century, was quite dark. I'm not sure that it's brighter today. And this situation invited some professionals and intellectuals, economists, architects, landscape architects, urban planners, foresters, etc., to work on new economic, political, and spatial proposals in order to avoid all kinds of speculation on land, money, and on human workforce, and to imagine new ways of life on Earth, more respectful of its resources, natural ecosystems, but also of the living world, humans being part of it. According to them, the evolution of the United States, mainly from the 80s, was a betrayal of the American democracy, such as it has been defined by the founding fathers of the Republic of the United States. They totally rejected the evolution of the political and the economic systems, in other words, omnipotent capitalism, which sole goal was to make more money in a shorter time, even if it meant to destroy irremediably natural resources, landscapes, and local populations. They all try to fight against metropolization, or what Benton McKay qualified as the invasion of the metropolitan world. It didn't mean the expansion of urbanization, but the expansion of the capitalistic world symbolized by New York in the United States, which was killing the natural ecosystems, but also the local cultures and economies, leaving behind only devastated lands, landscape, ruined populations, and a totally standardized world. Their thought was also fed or enriched by new studies made in scientific fields such as geography, anthropology, ethnography, but also in arts, literature, in order to identify the different roots of the American civilization. Most of those intellectuals were opposed to the colonial power of the great cities on the whole country, in order to strengthen their own wealth and power. In many regions of the South and Southwest appeared at the end of the 1910s the first Back to the Land movement. So as we can see, the United States had to face economic crises in the urban and the rural world, ecological crisis, but also cultural crisis, since the ideal of the United States as an agrarian nation was whipped out by the capitalistic forces of the industrial world. It is important to understand this specific context in order to understand the thoughts or visions proposed by the two main characters I will focus on tonight. They were trained in different fields. One is a forester, the second is an architect, but they both share the same sad diagnosis about their country, the same references such as Emerson or Thoreau, the same idea of nature, and the same belief of its significance for the development of humans, as well as of healthy and balanced society. For both of them, it was urgent to restore a new balance between the urban and the rural worlds, and in order to do so, the main aim was to reduce the power of the city and to distribute the different activities on the land according to the natural resources available, the potential offered by a specific ground. This meant to plan a new way of living, more respectful of the earth as well as of humans, so they would regain dignity as human beings. So the first character is Benton McKay, and the second is Frank Lloyd Wright. I use the term vision for both of their proposals because both of them propose a kind of new world, an utopian vision according to some critics. I couldn't find any exchange, letter or otherwise, between them both, but they had a common friend who contribute largely to the dissemination of their ideas, Lewis Mumford. Lewis Mumford and Benton McKay were two of the founding members of the Regional Planning Association of America with Clarence Stein and Henry Wright and others. The documentary, The City, we saw a first slide about this documentary, perfectly illustrates the idea promoted by the RPAA, in particular the idea of community planning in order to offer a better environment for the communities of inhabitants, children included. We usually know the work of the RPAA mainly through the project for Radburn, designed in 1928. But the work and influence of Benton MacKay within the RPAA are usually disregarded, at least until now. However, they are essential, as Lewis Mumford explained it in 1968 in his introduction to the reprint of MacKay's book, The New Exploration, A Philosophy of Regional Planning. Mumford wrote, "MacKay's activities, MacKay's ideas, and above all MacKay's generosity of spirit played a decisive part in all our work, modifying our city-minded approach, enlarging our horizons, and bringing into our lives the voice and touch of an older America, the America of the eastern wilderness and the western frontier, an heritage that we ignore at our peril." MacKay proposed to them to reverse the way they were thinking the problem and to start from the land, from the region, instead of thinking everything from the city. In order to do so, it was necessary, according to him, to implement a new exploration. What does it mean? Culture and man, explained MacKay, needs land and developed natural resources as a tangible source of bodily existence. It needs the flow of commodities to make that source effective. But first of all, it needs an harmonious and related environment as a source of its true living. These three needs a cultural man make three corresponding problems: the conservation of natural resources, the control of commodity flow, the development of environment. The visualization of the potential working of these three processes constitutes the new exploration and regional planning. The essentials of the old exploration were actualities. The essentials of the new exploration are potentialities. The old exploration described that which is, while the new exploration projects that which can be. The first was based on descriptive science. The second is based on applied science. MacKay had the opportunity to share his ideas with Patrick Geddes in 1923. Both were in search of new tools and methods in order to think differently in a very world. During one of their discussions, Geddes suggested to MacKay the term geotechnics to qualify this new comprehensive science MacKay was trying to define. It made sense for MacKay, who immediately adopted the new term. But how to define it to his colleagues? Then he recalled the way the Professor William Morris Davis, geologist and geographer, began his opening lecture at Harvard University in 1988. "Gentlemen," he said, "here is the subject of our study, this planet, its lands, waters, atmosphere, and life, the abode of plant, animal, and man, the Earth as a habitable globe." So, explained MacKay with the help of Geddes and Davis, he could define geotechnics as the applied science of achieving for the habitable globe a greater habitability. Then it was simplified that way, the applied science of making the Earth more habitable. What does it mean by habitability? It took him many years, mainly during the 1920s, to define the different aspects of it. And reading MacKay today, we understand that what he was trying to define was mainly sustainability. MacKay indeed explained that there are three kinds of habitability. First, physical, second, economic, and third, social. Physical habitability is that quality of an area whereby its natural resources remain intact. To preserve this quality requires sustained use. Soil fertility renewed, forest cut limited to growth, water tables maintained, restoration to nature of what is taken from her, including garbage and sewage, in a word, maintenance of ecological balance. 2, economic habitability is that quality of an area of sphere of activity whereby men and women are unable to make a living. This involves the problems of commodity flow from natural resources to consumers and the balance between surpluses and deficiencies. Social habitability is that quality of an area whereby men and women are unable to enjoy living. This involves movement of population or folk flow. Applied geotechnics combines all three kinds of habitability, conclude McKay. Because the term geotechnic was largely misunderstood, even by his friends, such as Lewis Mumford, McKay continued to use the term regional planning in order to promote this new exploration, which was essential, according to him, to work on a greater habitability. But even the terminology regional planning wasn't a simple one. What is planning and what is region? Asked McKay in his article, Regional Planning and Ecology, in 1940. He answered that way. Planning is discovery and not invention. It is a new type of exploration. Its essence is visualization, a charting of the potential now existing in the actual. And what is the thing that is planned? He continued. We will see now that the question is more complex than we think. McKay then explains the final thing planned is not mere area or land, but movement or activity. This truism gives a clue to what the planner means by region. It's something more than an area. It is an area or seat of movement. It is what the dictionary calls a sphere, a circuit, or range of action or influence. I will not quote the whole article, however, I think that it's interesting to take a few more minutes to take note of the definition he gave then of regional planning, which is, this definition is different from the one he wrote with Mumford in 1925 for the Encyclopedia Britannica. He wrote in 1940, regional planning is a comprehensive ordering or visualization of the possible or potential movement, activity, or flow from sources onward on waters, commodities, or population within a defined area or sphere for the purpose of laying therein the physical basis for the good life or optimum human living. Regional planning is ecology, it's human ecology. Its concern is the relation of the human organism to its environment. Regional planning, in short, is applied human ecology. Here is a mutual charting of region to man and of man to region. I know that you all have the question in mind. These are words, but practically, what does it mean? Did McKay put into practice this new exploration? Yes, he tried many times, but it didn't succeed. As I told you, he was a forester. He was the first one graduated in 1905 by the New School of Forestry in Harvard. The same year, in 1905, was created the United States Forest Service, directed by Gifford Pinchot, who hired him immediately. In this new service, McKay worked on the surveys of the great forests of the north part of the United States, and as such contribute, for example, to the preservation and creation of the White Mountain National Forest. The studies he made proved what was then a large debate in the United States, namely that the large floods in some river valleys, as the Tennessee River, or the serious droughts in some other regions, were not natural phenomena, but impacts of human action, deforestation. For Pinchot and for Mackay, it was possible and urgent to work on sustainable maintenance of the forest, and it meant to keep it within the public domain of the United States. And because the intellectual circle he was part of, Mackay became very perceptive to economic problems, and he started to work on new economic solutions based on the preservation of natural resources combined with social reforms. For him, the land, the natural resources, were the major source of employment. His idea was to propose a new kind of colonization by small communities organized as cooperatives for rural activities, agriculture, forestry, but also for small industrial production. But the United States Forest Service wasn't the right place to develop and promote his economic theories, so he changed and integrated the Department of Labor to work with Louis Post, who had worked with Henry George. Within this new service, Mackay wrote many reports regarding resources, employment, cooperation between farmer and consumer, and in 1919, the report, famous report, Employment and Natural Resources, Possibilities of Making New Opportunities for Employment Through the Settlement and Development of Agricultural and Forest Lands and Other Resources. In this report are detailed his ideas about this new kind of development he envisioned for the United States. Small communities, cooperatives, producing their wealth from agriculture, forestry, in such a way that a direct link would be created between farm colonies and city market. One of the main principles promoted by this development consisted, I quote him, in public control sufficient to eliminate everything resembling, even remotely, the speculation in or private appropriation of natural or community-made values. Another principle is the utilization of increased efficiency wherever possible to reduce labor time and thus enlarge the opportunity of employment, end of quote. It was a way to bring work where the population was, so men and women wouldn't have to leave to find a job in big inhuman city. On the contrary, they would live comfortably and harmoniously with the nature thanks to technological progress. As a matter of fact, decentralization was now possible thanks to the telephone, automobile, electric power, etc. And the first special proposal he really made was in 1921, and it was the Appalachian Trail, a project in regional planning. Some of you may know the Appalachian Trail, which is today a footpath that follows the crest of the Appalachian Mountains from the Mount Washington to the Mount Mitchell, so from Maine to Georgia through 14 states. The trail still exists today, but the regional planning as envisioned by Mackay was never carried out, even if he got the support of social reformers such as Clarence Stein, Louis Post, Charles Whittaker. Benton Mackay's idea was to maintain the Appalachian Mountains within the public domain in order to stop the metropolitan world of the East Coast and to develop along the trail a new way of life and a non-profit economy based on cooperation and mutual helpfulness. This is his word. According to Mackay, it was a new approach to the problem of living, because it was now possible to increase the efficiency of our working time thanks to the machine. And so to solve the problem of labor, it was also possible to widen the possibilities for leisure, according to him. Appalachian Mountains will be the best place to spend this leisure time, and the trail created and maintained by volunteers would attract first small communities for camping, They would build shelter camps, still a non-profit activity, managed by small communities on a land strictly delimited and planned in order to prevent all kind of real estate venture. Then would come gradually, according to him, food and farm camps and forest camps, depending on the potentialities of the land, once again based on cooperation and on a cooperative economy. The proposal was based on a very precise and comprehensive survey. Mackay estimated that there are in the Appalachian trade belt probably 25 million acres of grazing and agricultural land awaiting development. Here is a job for 40,000 souls, is stated as a conclusion of his presentation of the project. Mackay's vision was right on one point. The trail attracted many lovers of nature, hikers, hunters, campers, but they didn't really share the same idea of nature. And very quickly appeared another lover of nature, the one who thought that the natural landscapes should be discovered driving instead of walking. The National Park Service of the US opened at that time hundreds of miles of new roads toward, but also within the national parks and other protected areas, attracting hordes of reckless drivers. Save the Wilderness from Coney Island, implored Mackay in 1931 in a letter to Roosevelt. It became obvious to him that human being was unable to adopt the kind of development he had envisioned in 1921 in order to live in harmony with nature. His battle then became another one. It was to protect wilderness. In the lecture, Why the Appalachian Trail, he gave in 1935 to defend his project, he claimed, "One function of true wilderness is to provide a refuge from the crassitude of civilization, whether visible, tangible, audible. The advertising sign, whether board or edifice, the grade way known as the grade A, the auto horn or its refrain, the radio. All these are urban essences. All are negations of the wilderness. No true Appalachian trail can follow within the influences of many of these invasions, for the Appalachian Trail is a wilderness trail or is nothing." So he lost the battle of the trail, which became mainly a recreational facility. During the 30s, it was part at the beginning of the team of the Tennessee Valley Authority, but he resigned very quickly because his colleagues didn't share his idea of hygiene of the earth. They mainly used bulldozer, and he disagreed, of course, with this kind of with this way to treat nature. So, in 1935, with Aldo Leopold and others, they founded the Wilderness Society in order to protect vast areas of wilderness of human action. In April 1935, was shown under the auspices of the National Alliance of Arts and Industry organized by at the Rockefeller Center in New York, the now famous model of Broadacre City, built by the apprentice of the Tilesian Fellowship. It was built with the purpose to explain to the general public a new cooperative and democratic way of life on Earth. The 12-foot by 12-foot model shows 4 square miles of a typical seat of government on which is settled a community of 1,400 families, living since 4 generations according to the principles of Broadacre. Its inhabitants founded a real decentralized society, fully democratic according to right, living in harmony with its environment. Most of the public saw the model as something that should be built one day, whereas for Wright, it was built to explain principles, the principles of a new democratic life in America. We can discern some of those principles on the panel Living in America. No private ownership, no landlord and tenant, no housing, no slum, no traffic problem, etc. So as we can see, Broadacre City was more than an architectural project. It was mainly a political and economic project, aspects that have been blurred by the model built for the 1935 exhibit. As Wright repeatedly insisted, in order to understand the model and the concept of Broadacre, we must learn to read between the lines. It was a reaction and answer to the contemporary architectural debate, as well as to the economic, sociological, and ecological crises. We often neglect this last point. I won't have time to discuss all these aspects of Broadacre. I will just outline the main principles of it. Most of them were explained in the article Broadacre City, a new community plan written by Wright and published in the April issue of the Architectural Record to accompany the exhibit. This title and the photos chosen to illustrate the project have a special meaning in themselves. The model shows a new organization of the community and is built by the entire community of the Taliesin Fellowship, as we can see it on the photos. It means that Broadacre City is a collective work carried out by the entire population united by the same idea. Wright explains that the model depicts a very long process from generation to generation. It doesn't represent a final or perfect stage to be reproduced as such. On the contrary, it illustrates a transition scheme, the work done by 4 generations of inhabitants living according to Broadacre City's principles, and they will continue to do so in the future. The time dimension of Broadacre refers to the cycles of life as well as of nature, as always in Wright's architectural thought. Broadacre City sets itself up as a critic of the selfishness of our societies, which mainly care about the present time, their own comfort and well-being, but very rarely about what will happen to their children. So the model illustrates how is organized on the ground an Estonian community, in other words, a fully democratic, decentralized society living in harmony with its environment, according to Wright, of course. Each family lived in its own house, the Estonian house, built on its own homestead of 1 acre, growing, if it so wished, fruits, vegetables, etc. The homestead is surrounded by small farms, small industry, orchards, and all kinds of services. All the buildings are, as well as all elements of infrastructure, are of the same quality, everything being designed by the county architect according to the principles of organic architecture. Wright notes many times, I quote him, "It is true that landscape becomes architecture just as architecture becomes a kind of landscape, but both are integral with the ground and are an orchestration of form according to nature. Right in the midst of the future city, we have fields of flowers and grain. Right in the farming section are the buildings of industry, culture, recreation, and residence. Right in the midst of all is a marketplace, a perpetual fair, and anywhere in it all folks may live happily at work." Such a decentralization of all activities means that it's impossible to dissociate anymore the rural world from the urban one. To reiterate, Wright insisted, I quote him, The basis of the whole is general decentralization as an applied principle and harmonious architectural reintegration of all units into one fabric. Wright hoped that his contemporaries would be the first generation of Estonians living as inhabitants of the earth, conscious of its value. Broadacre is supposed to show the way towards a more democratic world where human beings would not fight anymore against nature, but on the contrary, would adopt a way of life respectful of it, and by extension, respectful of themselves, of human beings. It illustrates the idea that human beings would settle on Earth in relation with the natural resources available on the ground, and these resources would be managed by the whole community by means of cooperatives, once again, or by the government, but in any case, not by big private firms or trusts. The cooperative economy is essential for Wright in order to avoid speculation on the human work as well as on the resources itself, and to prevent the destruction of resources to preserve natural landscapes and ecosystems. Once again, Broadacre is not against progress, but progress doesn't mean for Wright the destruction of man's environment for immediate profits. Benefits, as it has been the case from the 19th century onward. Machines are used in Broadacre City, but in such a way that they respect both the human being and his environment. Broadacre, according to Wright, is fighting against metropolization, the standardization of the world imposed by the monopoly of the metropolis by the way of its economy and power. Metropolization, according to Wright, but he wasn't alone to think that way, as we could see earlier, means the destruction of natural resources, the ruin of landscapes, the disappearance of the traditional rural economy, killed off by intensive farming, and the dying out of local cultures. The ground itself is a true sociological basis, and when rightly interpreted, the salt and savor of all good life maintained right. This is in relation with another very important point. Broadacre City is based on a local economy versus the global market, if I'm using today's word. In Broadacre City, the community has succeeded in releasing itself from the influence of lobbies and markets imposed by the metropolis and the big business. It has set up a new economy based on the most direct route between the producer and the consumer in order to eliminate the middleman, it was a term used by Wright, who speculates on the work of the producer and enrich himself at the producers and the consumers' expense. Wright explained that one of his main references regarding this subject is Silvio Gesel's book, Natural Economic Order, that was published in 1916, from whom he borrowed the idea of free money and free land. So food is produced locally in Broadacre City as well as so many goods. They are produced in small farms, small industries, small workshops, and everything is sold in the cooperative market. You see the project on this slide. The stake of the local economy is important at different levels. First, the population can enjoy a much better and fresher and much less expensive food. Second, it doesn't destroy ecosystems. Small farmers and producers take care of their lands, river, forest, unlike intensive farming or big firms, according to Wright. Culture is a word frequently used by Wright speaking about Broadacre City. It refers to agriculture, of course, but also to the cultural fact. Both are growing from the soil. It is the reason why human has to stay connected with the ground and has a duty to preserve its qualities and potentials in order to preserve his own subsistence and life. That is also why the study and the understanding of nature are so important for Wright in the education of every child. We can see, looking at the model or at this plan, that small schools, small university are distributed in the middle of the community. Decentralization means that the right to education is the same everywhere on the ground. It is one of the foundations of democracy. In Broadacre City, every child can walk to school or to the university, as well as to the theater, the museum, and so on. All are public services and are fairly distributed, so the whole population can access to the same level of education and culture. It is why, according to Wright, there is no more difference between the city and the countryside. Each inhabitant has the same rights, can have access to the same services regarding education, culture, health, etc., and has also equal opportunities regarding employment. I quote him once again. Here, the agrarian, the industrialist, the artist, the scientist, and the philosopher meet on the ground itself. It may not be logical, but is the rising sun logical? It's natural, and that is better, claim Wright. So Broadacre City is the entire country and predicated on the basis that every man, woman, and child in America is entitled to own an acre of ground so long as they live on it or use it, explain also Wright. One word is very important. The ownership is related to the use of the land. The owner has to improve it, but he can speculate on it or ruin it or destroy it. Wright stated that the analysis of the basis of human poverty made by Henry George in his book Progress and Poverty has never been refuted. In 1953, he explained in the book 6, which is a chapter written to be part of his autobiography. I quote him. The preface to the Natural Economic Order, so Gezel's book, and the preface to Progress and Poverty, Henry George's book, are two of the finest things in recording English. Both are an exposition of principles rather than panacea, both dealing with land and money with a simplicity seeming naive to the prestidigitators of interest, our professional economist, end of quote. So Broadacre City, argues Wright, is based on genuine capitalism. Capitalism made organic since it is broadly based upon the ground and the individual upon the ground. Let us call it organic capitalism, and that is the promise of true democracy, end of quote again. As many American intellectuals at that time, Wright was looking for a third way between capitalism and communism. Many of his friends were progressive professors teaching at the University of Wisconsin, such as the economist John Cummins. In Chicago, you have here all the references of Broadacre. In Chicago, Wright was so part of the intellectual circle around the Hull House and Jane Addams, where he met also Veblen and John Dewey. Just like his friend John Dewey, Wright was struggling against the big business. That's why everything is small in Broadacre City, as you could see on the plan. In 1940, Franklin Wright distributed the new publication, Taliesin, published by the Taliesin Fellowship, entitled The New Frontier, Broadacre City. As you may probably understand now, this new frontier is not a geographical one, but it's mainly an economic, political, and social issue. We have a confirmation of this fundamental meaning of Broadacre City in the foreword he wrote in 1944 in his new book, When Democracy Builds. He explained then, I quote him, "Once upon a time, the conquering of physical or territorial realm was the new frontier, but to conquer sordid and ugly commercialism in this machine age, this bony fiber of the dry tree, this conquest is now the new frontier. Only by growing a healthy aesthetic in the soul of our polyglot people can we win this victory, the greatest of all victories, end of quote. This aspect of Broadacre City was probably the most difficult to understand, since we expect an architect to work on spatial proposals and not on political economic solutions. By only the few deplored right was the city recognized for what it really was, a relaxed, resilient, fundamentally free structural form for the life that will someday become one great free city, so founded in common sense as to make human life not only more secure, but more beautiful. 80 years later, Broadacre City still invites us, I believe, to think about this common sense that should lead us toward a more democratic world. Broadacre City has nothing to sell, but it does ask you to think right awareness. In the same way, it seems to me that Benton McKay's warning resonates even louder in our contemporary world. In 1951, he stated, "Our subject is geotechnics, how to use the earth from dooryard to globe. In the normal years of yesterday, we might stress the dooryard, but please, Mr. Geotechnist Statement, Citizens Hall, in the urgent hours of our day, keep your eye on the globe." And I thank you very much.
Is there any question from the audience?
I'm sorry for my broken English. I hope that you could understand it.
I will break the ice, and while you were presenting your very inspiring topic, I was wondering how, because I see that the conclusion applies to the present time. It's, of course, a very impellent question. But I was wondering how this story that you have been unraveling is like American, and how it may be, it may shed light on the European context, which is so different. All this myth of wilderness and so on, for the Americans, is even very present culturally wise in literature. And even the training that these people had, like, for example, Frank Lloyd Wright, is completely different from what a European architect of that same generation might have. Also, what the city is, what the country is, it's very different, I think, if you think about the United States and Europe. So how do you, comment on what was the impact of this American debate on Europe, and how do this event, let's say, may help us out in the European, facing those same problems in a European context?
But I think, you're perfectly right. I think that we are here in the American cultural context, which is so different. But the question raised are the question we all have to face right now. So what I think is interesting is to discovering those thoughts. They are almost 100 years ago, And for an historian, because I'm architect, but I'm an historian, it's very interesting to see the cycles. What I'm interested in cycles. So of course we are in the American context, for sure. And this is thought in the American context with all the American cultures. That's why I started with Thoreau and Emerson, because it's really what is at the base of those thoughts, both of them. And I don't know if you can read, because maybe it's too dark, or there is too much light. But here you have, a kind of bibliography to understand Broadacre. So, but what does interest me is that to see how what they say at that time is really echoes to our contemporary world. Because at that time they just try to face all the problems we have to face right now. And they were not the only ones. It's just because for me it was interesting to work on those two thoughts. But because they were, working at the same time. They were related also, of course, to the American context, but also to their time, during the 1920s and 30s. And it's also very interesting because, for example, Broad City was really understood by some intellectuals during the 1930s. But after the Second World War, nobody could understand anymore. Nobody could understand anymore the community market when they were building a supermarket and shopping malls. And they couldn't understand anymore. They were not anymore in the crisis. And what is interesting for an historian, so I was speaking about cycle, is to see when you have moments of crisis and some ideas emerge, and sometimes they re-emerge, and we forget it. Then, after the crisis, we forget it. I don't know so about all the ecological problem or environmental problem we have to face now. My question as historian is, we will really forget also now, or the climate change are so brutal that we can't avoid to face it. But it's, I don't know.
So thank you. It was very dense. Absolutely. I don't know, maybe as a question, maybe as a short comment. While you were talking and explaining, I was thinking about the concept of this detachment. And I don't know if it's about cycles or about history repeating itself, but I think this detachment from the nature is what my team is finding now in many of the case studies we are researching. So while in the moment, at the beginning of this internal colonization of these new modern landscapes, the nature was very attached to the people. The people were totally attached to the nature because they were depending on this. There was at a certain point in the history, because of the Second World War, end of colonialism, end of the GDR and so on, it was a completely cut, and new forces start playing, global market, globalization, and so on, so that nowadays, I take the example of the GDR, people are completely detached from the nature because they don't own it, they don't produce anything from these fields, they look at it, but they cannot use it. And so it's quite a kind of a dichotomy that these people are living in the countryside, seeing nature, but completely being detached from it. And this was, for me, one of very inspiring aspect of your
But I think that this question of nature in Europe, I'm probably wrong saying in Europe, because we don't define nature in the same way in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Greece, and so it's nature is a very cultural fact. So the definition of nature, it's really, and in the United States, it's really, I wrote another book about that, the way nature play a so important role in the definition of this new civilization. From the first colonization arriving from Europe. So it's very interesting. And also because in Europe, most of the inhabited world was already transformed. It was a domesticated nature. And when they arrived in the United States, it was what they called during in the 19th century wilderness. So it's really, and it's interesting to see that. So the difference between the wilderness, the countryside, and the built landscape, or the cultural landscape, also a term of the 20th century. And I think it's essential to understand really some thoughts and developed during the 20th century. And in the United States, for example, you have since the 1980s, landscape urbanism, ecological urbanism. So, you know, it's, I mean, it's not, there's nothing to do with this kind of, for example, some of the ecological urbanisms, their references are Benton McKay or, you know, so, so I think it's really, we can't compare Europe and the United States. It's just...
Thank you for your very impressive lecture. I enjoy very much. And I was wondering, we are comparing United States and Europe in a way of approaching nature, I would say, between commas, what it's. And I think it's very curious to realize that the great transformation of Europe, I mean the denaturalization of Western and Europe mainly, occurred after the World War II with the Marshall Plan. So in a way, Europe received, you know, all the pushing from United States. There are beautiful, I remember an incredible series of German films from the 80s, I think, called Heimat. It was very interesting, you remember. It was the transformation of a village, really true, would say, a village local, regional, in a round circle of life, I would say sustainable, and using first plastics, and all things are transforming. So, in a way, this is, in fact, very strange to me to realize how the little Europe was pushing to be more industrialized, and I would say the rural landscape got a terrible transformation, mainly the countries or the places in the middle Europe, not so much, I would say, the peripheries. We are quite lucky, the ones like me. I'm from Portugal, so we still have landscape, I would say. But this is just, I would like you to have your comment on this. And also, I was very curious when you talked about the capitalist approach, as far as I understood, of Frank Lloyd Wright on his Broadarka city. And the question is, this was a kind of city or a kind of a development for rich people, or could be, let's say, a democratic thing, just we want you more?
No, it was, so the lecture, Broadarka city, during the second part of the 20th century was, how to say, you find this project in all the books about the suburb, you know. So Broadarka city, from the 50s onwards, just be compared to all the suburban developments, and Wright was the one who really want to promote cars, houses for the middle class. But, and I try to explain that it's not that. I mean, what he understood, and what does interest me with Benton McKay or Wright, is that they already understood what will happen during the second part of the 20th century. Because intensive farming was already there. Intensive farming was made for the big market, or also all the small farms disappeared because you had huge farms just to produce food for New York, the big cities. So already what we all know today, and it was already there in the United States. And also the development of the first suburbs. So he said at that time that the only way to fight the city and the evolution of the city with the suburb, with the global market, etc., it was to build a new society. And this new society, so small farmers, so the farm is 5 acres, not more. It could be more if the family is larger, etc. Small farms, small homesteads, small firms, small workshops, everything is small, just to avoid big concentration of business. And that, what is interesting is that you find many articles, it was really understood during the 30s. And then it's what I say, they forget everything. It's just because after the Second World War, you know, with Marshall Plan, and the United States, they were speaking about growth, and it wasn't just not anymore in the idea of the moment, I mean. But during the 30s, yes, why? Because there were many families living the city, and they bought a plot of land and they grow their fruit, vegetables, etc. And the houses he made at that time, the Estonian houses, were made for those families. So the Estonian houses, for example, he worked during the 30s about a very low, not expensive way to build house, and even with auto construction, the way people could build themselves the house or a part of it, just to lower the cost of the house. So, but once again, this is in the specific context of the United States during the 1920s and 30s. Yes, but also because you had Roosevelt during the 30s. And why this project was made at that time, it's just because Fry didn't have any money. So some friend bring the money to build the model and the exhibition. And the exhibition went in many cities. And it was really with Roosevelt, you know, he really saw that it was the moment to do something, to change things. But Roosevelt didn't really, he tried, but the first New Deal, the second New Deal is not really in the same, how to say, during the first New Deal, most of them believed that they could change really things. And during the second New Deal, they already start, okay. It was, and then during the war, you know, they all, were completely right was against the war. So the battle was against the United States during the war.
Shall we maybe connect to?
Yeah, that's well. There was. There are 2 points I wanted to make. One, which perhaps should be made better, I think, is that Mackay was literally thinking politically in a quite realistic way, I would say, given the time and the particular conditions of the country, political conditions of the country. Frank was right, frankly utopian. So it is a complete utopia. And in reality, there is a huge, because I've analyzed the plan a lot with my students teaching urban theory and urban form, there's a huge contradiction in the plan, or let's say in the model, because there's a fascination for the model. The model is an extremely impressive work of urbanism, which is for me a complete contradiction with his original intention. And when I mean a work of urbanism, it's also a work of regional urbanism, or regional planning. It's an enormous work in terms of infrastructure. And what Frank Lloyd Wright doesn't talk about is, in fact, the quantity of capital that would be needed to actually replan the countryside as he meant it. And of course, there are exaggerations in the project, like the mile-high skyscraper, which is in a corner, and so on. But the enormous amount of capital that would be needed to actually produce a plan of that sort, on that dimension, is not explained. And so for me, it's always been a contradiction between the will of working at the small scale with the 1 acre and so on, and the enormous public investments that would be needed to actually realize such a project, which is impossible to be done by little farmers. So who would plan it? What would the bureaucracy be that would actually organize it? The planning department, the regional department. It's an extraordinary work, but in a way completely utopian, because like the utopian city, it actually needed a very important power structure to place it and to realize it. And I think Frank was right, as far as I know, does not really explain what is that superstructure that will eventually allow to do that. And of course, if you compare, I've done that with my students, you take, the same acreage of the plan, and then you put it on Google Earth. It's very easy to do at the same scale, and realize, of course, the hyper-intensity of the plan. I mean, eventually he wants to demonstrate everything. I mean, there are theaters, there are skyscrapers, there are harbors, but that, from a political or socio-economic point of view, I don't think it's explained. But
no.
You've written more than me on this.
No, but I will answer very quickly. It's not a plan. The only question is not a plan. So the model was made just because his friend told him, okay, we share your idea. You are an architect. You have to show us the idea with models, with plan, because otherwise nobody will understand them. And so he made the model, but the problem is that the model became probably the main problem for Broadacre City, because it's not a plan at all. And he's writing that, and that's why also he says that we have to read between the lines, and we have to read all the text about Broadacre City in order to understand it, but not to look at on the model. So it's the only answer I can give right now. And I'm not sure that Benton Mackay's project was really easier to build, because it was the same ideal behind his project. So, but Benton Mackay, he didn't produce a model, so at least it's
Simon, can we collect another question?
Sadly, we have to stop now because the dinner is actually waiting. And the food waits for nobody. So thank you very much, Catherine. That was extremely good. Thank you again. Now,